Most of the problems that we see today in our inner cities are a direct result of this social engineering of the 60s, specifically because part of the means test, part of qualifications boil down to don't work, don't save, and don't get married. And
remember what Moynihan said, these Great Society programs, in his manifesto, he said these Great Society programs would be the doom of a minority and disadvantaged people in this country, because he saw it. He saw what welfare would do when you take away one's initiative, when you take away the example of a child seeing their parent come home and work, when you take away the initiative of working by the sweat of your eyebrow, when you take that away, the initiative, you may not see it at first generation, but as time progresses, it begins to wear down not just a segment of society, but it begins to impact the whole of society. Out of wedlock births, infant mortality, crime-infested neighborhoods, to the point where you've taken away the will for people to do for themselves, that you've created a permanent victim class.
I lived a very aggressive life, and actually I bought all the lies of the liberals through my childhood in the 70s, that the idea that we don't have to be responsible with the choices that we made, that there are no absolute rules, moral relativism. It was all throughout society. This is the sexual revolution. This was the rebellious time. The generation right before me went off to Vietnam, and so there was this anti-war spirit and anti-conformity spirit in our society. And then there was also growth of government to say that if there are any natural consequences to decisions you're making, we have now safety nets. And so it's very easy for me to live recklessly and then look to government to solve the problems that came from that type of careless living. I ended up not only in my criminal life doing drug addiction and opportunities of direct crime, but in the area of sexuality, I didn't have to look at any of the other disciplines in life, perhaps marital life or birth control, because government in my state was so willing to pay for abortion, and or if I decided to keep the child, they'd so willingly send me money on the 1st and 15th of the month. So I ended up living in and out of welfare 7 years, 3.5 years consistently, until I had a religious conversion that some Christian people confronted my lifestyle and told me that it was unacceptable to God. And that's when I started really thinking about some of the choices and decisions that I was making in my personal life.
Up until 1965, 82% of all black families had a man and a woman raising children. Even in the face of this, the 10 years of the Depression, even with discrimination, Jim Crow laws, segregation, even in the face of all these great injustices, the black community thrived.
My mother told us, even as people on welfare, young people growing up with I had no father, that you can still be whatever God has called you to be. Don't get held back by your circumstance. I heard that all my life. So I could never say, oh, I'm just a poor black kid from a family on welfare. I can't read. I can't aspire to greatness. I can't be excellent. She wouldn't allow it.
You're looking at a person that, as a child, for a season, welfare did what it should have done. That is to keep us from starving and to help to get us to the next phase. We have, of course, seen families that have been on welfare cases for 3 and 4 generations. And of course, that's not the way it ought to be. If a person needs it, it should be there to help them so they won't starve to death.
And with what we've done with government being the middleman, we don't even know what they need. So we cannot help them help themselves, because according to government, there's nothing more that they do need except us to pay for their home and send their kids to shoddy schools and give them a little bit of check every month with some food stamps. They set no goals for them at all. I used to live on welfare. One of the questions on the form during the 80s and all the way until we changed it in the 90s was, did anyone go back to school? And if you put yes, you were going to be penalized. This was a poverty program to ensure that they were going to stay in that state, and a whole bunch of bureaucrats were going to stay employed there. Because in Section 8 right now, under HUD policy, if you reunite with your husband, you will lose your Section 8 housing. And I can tell you firsthand of cases across this country of women who are in dilemmas because they want to reunite with the father of their 3 children, but if he moves into that house, they are subject to lose that home.
The welfare system has done exactly what slavery did to the black family. During slavery, they took the fathers out of the home, and you know, the mother was there to raise the children, and the master of the plantation, I guess, fed them. 40 years ago, the Democrats came in along with the civil rights leaders and said to black people, we're going to take care of you, but you can't have a father in the home. I remember this. You can't have a man in the home. And so they sold out. They took the man out of the home. The government became the daddy of the family.
I do think there are certainly instances where you have to help people that are in need, but this entitlement culture, especially the welfare culture that just absolutely pulled the man out from under the home, so we no longer depended on our men anymore, but looked to the government to be our husbands, our provider. I think it has just absolutely bankrupt the inner city community, and it's a sad thing to see.
Well, in the plantation, you always had the overseer, and his job was to keep the slaves working, scared, dedicated to master, fearing freedom more than they feared master.
For my book, the analogy is appropriate because Uncle Sam's plantation, which is big government moving in on a specific people group and trying to convince them that they're happy as slaves to government, depending on them from womb to tomb. Publicly, when it comes to my audience, I am very vocal against the Democrats trying to convince me to shut up simply because they have already built, you know, a constituency within Black America. And the reason that I really confront them strongly is because they're frankly lying to Black people about their history in Republican Party. They're lying to Black people about the role of government in their personal lives. And frankly, the liberal plantation mentality, attitudes, and laws have destroyed the Black family.
We had a press conference the other day in the battle of the judges. And we came out pro Justice Janice Rogers Brown. Same day we have a conference, there is this Congressional Black Caucus automatically says we're going to have a preemptive press conference. And they wheel out all these people. I didn't know that a handful of Black preachers, you know, 130 Black preachers or more, were so scary to the people that are in charge. But we are, because if Black people get off of this, you know, if we want to use the word plantation of the mind that the unaccountable democratic machine has us on, then we become a threat to them. So it's important. Oh, don't let them talk.
I want more individual Blacks say, I'm tired of it. I'll pay the price. Call me an Uncle Tom. But I'm going to make my own life. I'm going to live as an individual. One hopes that one by one people peel away, stop being so intimidated by this sort of Saddam Hussein leadership we have. But that's a very powerful leadership. And it really has us in the grip of fear. But those of us who are called Black conservatives are the freest people in the United States. We don't owe anybody anything.
There was a time in our history when Black Americans succeeded without government assistance, and their communities literally thrived. With this rich history of success and achievement, why aren't young Blacks being taught these facts today?
The wife of the man who claimed he owned me taught me how to read, Mrs. Hugh All. She'd been teaching me for nearly 1 year, until that day that I recall so vividly. You see, if you were the color of my skin, there were laws that were stated quite clearly. You were not allowed to read. Mr. Hugh All, my master, had learned, his wife had been teaching me, and he walked into the room where we were, stood over top of us, and shouted out, "Don't you ever teach them how to read. Don't you ever teach them how to read. Once you teach them how to read, they're free. Don't you ever teach them how to read. Not in my house. They're no good to themselves or to us. Don't you ever teach them how to read. Not in my house," he said.
I was recently talking with a group of major African-American bishops. And with those bishops, I pulled out the original documents because we have literally tens of thousands of original documents out of black history, out of all this history, and I'm showing all these legislators, all the first black U.S. senators that were Republican, all the state leaders that were Republican, black leaders, and we're going through and I'm showing the records out of Congress where the Democrats say, yes, we started the Klan, that was so going through all of this, and these black bishops asked me, how come we don't hear this in our history books?
There are two reasons, in my view, why the young blacks are not being taught their black history as it relates to the times when black people flourish in this country politically and economically, because they don't want the black people to know that. Why? Because if they knew all that, black people would actually leave the plantation.
But the reason why they don't teach it is because it doesn't empower supposedly the champion party of the little guy in this country.
Well, what is being taught in schools is revisionist history. I object to Black History Month. I think it ought to be history. Where blacks made a contribution, you just show their face. Prior to the civil rights movement in the 50s, the Brown decision, there was a rich tradition of black self-help. The black colleges used to publish a journal of black business success. But in order to get the civil rights laws to apply to blacks, we had to present ourselves as victims of racism. So in order to do that, we had to cease publishing the accounts of our success.
The civil rights movement moved from the righteous cause of Dr. Martin Luther King to emphasizing a much more dependency culture. It's then that education changed. It was important, of course, to wipe out this idea that before the welfare and the affirmative action and so forth and the entitlement programs came along, they needed to wipe out that we actually achieved without that, because of course they were making the case that the only way that we could continue to succeed is if in fact we were assisted externally.
Well, even when they are taught about the heroes, they're taught about all of these things in a context of victimization.
You'll never see Booker T. Washington's name, and that has to do with the fact that they all, I think, came together essentially to support this dependency victimization culture, and Booker T. Washington represented the antithesis of that, and so they couldn't show that before all of these different dependency programs that we actually had success in.
Of the 23 African Americans elected to the federal Congress, 13 had been slaves. Now, here's what really is fascinating with that. You're talking 1865, you're in slavery. You're talking 1870, 5 years later, you're now a member of Congress. I mean, that's a remarkable transition. But let me make it even more remarkable. In the southern states that allowed slavery, in many of those states, it was a capital offense to educate a slave. It could get you killed to teach a slave to read or write. But yet, we're going from being a slave in 1865 to being a member of Congress in 1870. That's a lot of education to get in 5 years. They were self-educated. Now, how much education can you get in 5 years? You want to know? You go to a website, you look up neglected voices on the web. It has the speeches of these first 23 black congressmen. These are speeches given on the floor of Congress by these guys who have been self-educated. So your first class of black congressmen to come to Congress, 1871 and 72, all 7 were Republicans. And it turns out that the first 23 African Americans elected to Congress were all Republicans. And of those 23, they are a remarkable class.
Even in high school and in junior high school, what I found is that the period from when African Americans were slaves to the civil rights movement, almost a gap of 100 years, that period is kind of just walked over as if African Americans are even a part of that history.
The first African American elected to Congress as a Democrat was not until 1935. And again, it was out of the state of Illinois, a free state, had always been free. But you did not have a Southern black elected as a Democrat until 1973. Came out of my state of Texas, Barbara Jordan. Came out of Georgia, Andrew Young. But to get Barbara Jordan out of my state of Texas, it took the U.S. Supreme Court intervening and ruling that the